Captain Imani Webb stood before the cockpit door of her own aircraft, her 4 gold stripes gleaming on her epaulets, and was told she didn't belong there. The gate agent's condescending smirk and the co-pilot's dismissive glare were more than just an insult. They were the first loose threads in a conspiracy of greed that risked the lives of thousands. They thought they were putting a black woman in her place. They had no idea they were pushing a brilliant pilot who would, in a few short weeks, ground their entire airline, expose a scandal that would rock the industry, and bring a rain of karma so devastating it would become a legend in every hangar and flight deck across the country. This isn't just a story of discrimination. It's the story of how one woman's humiliation became an entire corporation's reckoning. The sterile, recycled air of the jet bridge at Chicago O'Hare hummed with the quiet tension of imminent departure. For Captain Imani Webb, this was the sacred corridor between the chaos of the terminal and the serene order of her cockpit. It was her office, her sanctuary, her domain. At 36, she had earned her 4 stripes the hard way. Top of her class in aeronautical engineering at Purdue, years as a regional pilot flying through treacherous mountain weather, and finally a coveted captain's seat at Ascendair, a rapidly growing national carrier. She carried her flight bag over one shoulder, her stride confident, her uniform immaculate. Ascendair Flight 1128 to San Diego was her leg. As she approached the aircraft door, she saw the gate agent, a woman in her late 50s with a severe blonde bob and a name tag that read, Karen Miller, locked in a tense conversation with her first officer, Mark Gallagher. Mark was a decade younger than Imani, with the kind of smug frat boy charm that the airline's old guard seemed to favor. He was known for being a decent stick-and-rudder pilot, but possessing an ego that barely fit in the cockpit. "I'm just saying," Karen was whispering, her voice a harsh rasp, "it doesn't look right. The manifest has a Captain R. Sterling scheduled." "They swapped him out this morning for a reserve captain," Mark replied, rolling his eyes. "Some web person, probably a guy. They just need to get the paperwork updated." Imani cleared her throat, a polite but firm sound. "Good morning, Mark. Ms. Miller." Both turned. Mark's face registered a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by a professional but cool nod. Karen Miller, however, looked Imani up and down, her gaze lingering on the dark skin of her face and hands, then on the 4 stripes on her shoulders, as if the two things were a logical contradiction. "Can I help you?" Karen asked, her tone dripping with saccharine suspicion. "Yes," Imani said, her voice even and calm. "I'm Captain Webb. I'm here to do the pre-flight inspection." Karen's eyes narrowed. She took a half step forward, physically blocking the path to the cockpit door. "I'm going to need to see your airline identification and a government-issued ID." It was an unusual request. While not strictly against protocol, it was almost never done, especially not to a uniformed captain at the door of their own aircraft. The uniform and the airline-issued credentials hanging from her neck were the ID. It was a clear, calculated slight. Imani felt the familiar prickle of anger, but she tamped it down with the iron discipline she applied to everything in her life. She calmly unclipped her Ascendair badge and handed it over, along with her driver's license. "Here you go." Karen Miller took the cards and scrutinized them under the harsh fluorescent light. She compared the photo to Imani's face, then back to the photo, then back again. "The manifest is still showing Captain Sterling," she insisted, handing the IDs back with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "As my first officer just stated, there was a last-minute schedule change. It happens all the time," Imani explained, her patience fraying. "The updated crew manifest is electronic. If you refresh your system, you'll see it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a plane to prepare for departure." She made a move to step past, but Karen shifted her weight, still blocking the way. It was then that Mark Gallagher, who had been watching with a detached smirk, decided to intervene in the worst way possible. "Look, Karen is just being thorough," he said, addressing Imani as if she were a flight attendant and not his commanding officer. "With all the security stuff these days, you can't be too careful. Why don't you just wait in the galley for a minute while we get Captain Sterling on the phone to confirm the swap?" The suggestion was so profoundly insulting, so deeply unprofessional, it took Imani's breath away. He was suggesting she, the captain, wait like a passenger while he, her subordinate, called the pilot she was replacing to verify her identity. It wasn't about security, it was about power. It was about her not fitting their image of a captain. The blood rushed to her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to unleash the fury she felt, to remind this arrogant co-pilot and this petty gate agent exactly who she was and the federal regulations that backed her authority. But she knew that was what they wanted. An outburst would only serve their narrative. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height. Her voice dropped, losing all its warmth and becoming the pure, cold command tone she used in emergencies. First Officer Gallagher, you will do no such thing. You will refer to me as Captain Webb. Ms. Miller, you have seen my credentials. You are now impeding a flight crew from performing their federally mandated duties. Step aside. Karen flinched at the change in her tone. Mark's smirk faltered. A few passengers who had started to board were now watching, their phones subtly raised. I'm just following procedure, Karen stammered, her confidence wavering. No, Imani corrected her calmly. You are inventing a procedure to satisfy a prejudice. My identity is confirmed. Now for the last time, step aside, or I will have airport security remove you from this jet bridge. The threat of involving a higher authority and the public spectacle it would create finally did the trick. Karen Miller's face flushed a blotchy red. She cast a helpless look at Mark, who offered nothing but a slight, cowardly shrug. With a theatrical huff, the gate agent stepped aside. Imani walked past them without another glance, her head held high, and stepped through the cockpit door. But the sanctuary had been violated. As she settled into the left-hand seat, the captain's seat, she could feel Mark's resentful gaze on her back. The air in the small space was thick with a toxic mixture of condescension and hostility. The pre-flight checklist felt different today. It wasn't just about checking gauges and systems anymore. It felt like she was being checked, tested, and judged. She strapped herself in, her mind a whirlwind of fury and humiliation. They had no idea who they had just provoked. They saw a woman they could push around. They would soon learn they had just pushed a meticulous, brilliant pilot who remembered everything. And as she began her methodical scan of the instrument panel, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker on a secondary maintenance screen caught her eye. It was nothing, probably a glitch. But in that moment, with her senses on high alert, she filed it away. A tiny anomaly on a day that was already full of them. The heavy cockpit door clicked shut, sealing the three of them, Imani, First Officer Mark Gallagher, and the palpable tension inside the nerve center of the Airbus A320. The air, already thin at altitude, felt suffocating. For the next 5 hours, this pressurized tube would be a microcosm of everything Imani had fought against her entire career. Mark settled into the right seat, his movements exaggeratedly relaxed, a stark contrast to the coiled anger radiating from him. He didn't make eye contact. Instead, he busied himself with his checklist, his voice a clipped, dispassionate monotone as they ran through the pre-flight procedures. Pre-flight check. Complete, Imani responded, her own voice a model of professionalism. APU. On and running. Flight management system. Programmed and cross-checked. It was a robotic exchange, stripped of the usual cockpit camaraderie, the light banter that makes long flights bearable. The third crew member, the relief pilot for long-haul routes who would typically occupy the jump seat, had called in sick. It was just the two of them. As they taxied toward the runway, the tension thickened. Mark was deliberately unhelpful. He was slow to respond to her commands, forcing her to repeat herself. He would forget to perform small, routine tasks, like setting a specific radio frequency or briefing the cabin crew on an expected patch of light turbulence, forcing her to pick up the slack. It was a classic campaign of passive aggression, designed to undermine her authority and create the impression that she wasn't in control. Imani recognized the game instantly. It was the same one played by certain flight instructors who doubted her, the same subtle sabotage from male colleagues who resented her promotions. Her response was always the same: flawless, unshakable competence. She didn't just meet the standard, she exceeded it, leaving no room for legitimate criticism. Mark, I need you to confirm the takeoff weight figures with dispatch one more time, she said, her tone level. The numbers they gave us seem a little light given the cargo manifest. He sighed, an audible expression of annoyance. I already confirmed them, Captain. They're fine. He put a slight mocking emphasis on her title. Confirm them again, please, First Officer, she said, not looking at him, her eyes focused on her instruments. I'd rather be thorough than fast. Your job is to support my command, not question it. Defeated by the direct order, he snatched the radio handset with unnecessary force and made the call. As it turned out, Imani's intuition was right. A digit had been transposed. The corrected weight was several thousand pounds heavier, affecting their takeoff calculations. It was a minor catch, but a crucial one. It was her first small victory in the psychological war being waged in her cockpit. Mark said nothing, but the set of his jaw tightened. The flight to San Diego was uneventful from a passenger's perspective. But inside the cockpit, a second, more insidious event was unfolding. With Mark offering the bare minimum of cooperation, Imani's workload was effectively doubled. This hypervigilance forced her to notice things a more relaxed pilot might miss. It started with the engine vibration monitor. The readings for Engine 2 were consistently at the very top of the acceptable green band. Not in the yellow caution zone, but high enough to be noteworthy. See that on Engine 2? She asked Mark, pointing to the screen. He glanced at it. It's in the green. It's fine. It's consistently high. Did you see any write-ups in the maintenance log during your walk-around? Nope. Logbook's clean. Probably just a sensor anomaly, he mumbled, already dismissing it. Imani wasn't so sure. A sensor anomaly was possible, but so was a developing mechanical issue. She made a mental note. Later, during a lull in the flight, she used the aircraft's communication and reporting system, ACARS, to pull up the recent maintenance history for their specific aircraft, tail number N94AA. She scrolled through pages of routine checks. Then she saw it. The log entry for the last A check, a standard overnight maintenance inspection, was signed off by a familiar name, Captain Richard Sterling, the very man she had replaced this morning. The note read, Engine 2 vibration sensor checked and recalibrated, operating within normal parameters. Something about it felt off. Captains rarely signed off on maintenance logs unless they were specifically overseeing a crucial repair or performing a post-maintenance check flight. And why would Sterling, a senior pilot, be involved in something as mundane as a sensor recalibration? Imani kept digging. She cross-referenced the part number for the sensor. Then she noticed another pattern. Over the past 6 months, this aircraft had a recurring series of minor but persistent issues. Flickering cabin lights, a sluggish hydraulic actuator on the landing gear, and this same high vibration reading on Engine 2. Each time the logbook showed a component had been replaced or recalibrated. And surprisingly often, Richard Sterling's name was nearby, either as the pilot who reported the issue or the one who flew the first leg after the fix. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. Each individual incident was plausible, but taken together they painted a picture of an aircraft that was being consistently patched up, not properly repaired. Anything interesting over there? Mark asked, his voice laced with sarcasm, noticing her intense focus on the flight computer. Just reviewing the ship's history, Imani replied coolly. It's good practice to know the quirks of the plane you're flying. This plane doesn't have quirks, he shot back. Ascendair runs a tight ship. Best maintenance record in the industry? Or so they say. Or so they say. The phrase hung in the air. A tight ship, or a ship that was good at making its records look tight. Her mind flashed back to the confrontation at the gate. The hostility from Karen and Mark wasn't just personal. It felt systemic, like they were defending a culture, a club she wasn't welcome in, a club that perhaps included pilots like Richard Sterling, a club that might be hiding something. As they began their descent into San Diego, the flight was smooth. The landing was perfect, a greaser, as pilots called it. As she applied the reverse thrusters and guided the massive plane off the runway, Imani felt the satisfaction of a job well done under difficult circumstances. She had proven her competence beyond any shadow of a doubt, but the victory felt hollow. The disrespect at the gate had been the spark, but the cold contempt in the cockpit and the troubling inconsistencies in the maintenance logs had ignited a fire of suspicion within her. This wasn't just about one flight or one crew. It was about the integrity of the entire airline. As the passengers deplaned, Mark unbuckled his seatbelt with a sigh of relief. Well, we made it. Guess you got us here in one piece. It was the closest thing to a concession she was going to get. That's the job, First Officer, she said, her eyes still on the maintenance logs displayed on her screen. But my job isn't just to get us from A to B, it's to make sure we can do it again tomorrow. And I'm not so sure about that anymore. Mark paused at the cockpit door, a look of genuine confusion and perhaps a hint of alarm on his face. He didn't understand. He thought their battle was over. Imani knew it had just begun. The layover in San Diego was short, just 24 hours. While Mark Gallagher likely spent his time at the hotel bar, complaining about his reserve captain from hell, Imani Webb turned her hotel room into an investigative headquarters. The feeling of wrongness, which had started as a prickle of injustice on the jet bridge, had now grown into a deep, unsettling conviction that something was dangerously rotten at the core of Ascendair. She couldn't shake the image of Richard Sterling's name in the maintenance logs. It was too convenient, too neat. Her first call was to a name deep in her contacts list, David Hayes. David was a brilliant, obsessively meticulous aircraft maintenance engineer who had been with Ascendair for 15 years. He'd been a mentor to her when she first joined the airline, teaching her to look past the pilot's checklists and understand the true mechanical soul of the machines she flew. 6 months ago, however, David had been abruptly laid off during a corporate restructuring. The official reason was redundancy. David had told her it was because he asked too many questions. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. Imani, is everything all right? David, I need your help. It's about Ascendair. I think I'm seeing something, and I need your eyes on it. Imani spent the next hour laying it all out. The confrontation with Karen and Mark, the tension in the cockpit, the high vibration readings on Engine 2, and the strange recurring presence of Captain Sterling's name in the logs for 914AA. She read him the part numbers, the dates, the descriptions of the fixes. On the other end of the line, David was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy. Imani, you need to be very, very careful. You're not just pulling on a loose thread. You're standing at the edge of a rabbit hole, and it goes deeper than you can imagine. What is it, David? What did you find? It's not just your plane, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It's a whole fleet of them. The 737s, the A320s, mostly the older models that are due for expensive overhauls. I started noticing it about a year ago. We'd get a plane in for a check with a recurring issue, a hydraulic leak, an avionics glitch, you name it. The book calls for a full component replacement, expensive, time-consuming. But then management would step in. A senior engineer from headquarters, sometimes even a chief pilot like Sterling, would consult on the problem. He paused and Imani could hear the faint sound of him typing on a keyboard. Suddenly, the problem would be re-diagnosed. It wasn't a failing hydraulic pump. It was a leaky seal. It wasn't a faulty avionics card. It was a loose connector. They'd perform a minor cheap repair, sign it off, and get the plane back in the air in a few hours instead of a few days. They're pencil whipping the maintenance, Imani breathed, the term for falsifying logs hitting her with the force of a physical blow. Worse, David corrected, pencil whipping implies they're doing nothing. They're doing just enough to make the problem go away temporarily, to reset the fault codes. But the core issue, the failing part, is still in there. Flying, getting older and more stressed with every single cycle. Imani's blood ran cold. Every takeoff and landing is a cycle, putting immense stress on an aircraft's components. Parts have a designated lifespan, measured in cycles, for a reason. Pushing them beyond that limit was like playing Russian roulette at 35,000 feet. How are they getting away with it? She asked. The FAA does spot checks. The paperwork has to match. That's the genius of the scheme, David explained, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and professional admiration for the sheer audacity of it. They created a paper trail that's almost perfect. They've partnered with a third-party supplier, a company called Aero Component Solutions, or ACS. No one's ever heard of them. When Ascendair needs a new part, say a turbine blade, they don't buy a new one from Boeing or Airbus. They buy a recertified one from ACS for a fraction of the cost. And these recertified parts? Imani prompted, already knowing the answer. They're junk, David said bluntly. They're old parts, timed-out parts, that have been cleaned up, given a fresh but fraudulent serial number in fake certification papers. ACS is a ghost company, a shell corporation. My guess is it's owned by someone high up inside Ascendair. They're selling their own worn-out parts back to themselves, pocketing the massive difference in cost, and creating a paper trail that looks legitimate to a cursory audit. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The high engine vibration wasn't a sensor anomaly. It was likely a worn-out turbine blade, bought from ACS, creating a subtle imbalance that would only get worse over time. Sterling wasn't just a pilot, he was an enabler, a company man who used his authority to sign off on these dangerous fixes, probably for a hefty kickback. Mark Gallagher was his protege, being groomed into this culture of cutting corners and looking the other way. The hostility from him and Karen Miller wasn't just about race or gender. It was the ferocious territorialism of people with a dirty secret to protect. They saw her, an outsider who was meticulous and by the book, as a threat to their entire corrupt system. David, I have the maintenance records for my plane for the last 6 months, Imani said, her mind racing. Can you tell what's real and what's from ACS? Send them to me. The fake parts have tells. The serial number formats are sometimes slightly off. The certification codes don't always match the manufacturing batch numbers. I created a database of the ones I suspected before they fired me. I can cross-reference. Imani spent the next 2 hours on her laptop, securely scanning and emailing every log page she had downloaded. It felt like assembling the evidence for a crime, because that's what it was, a massive, high-altitude conspiracy. As she worked, a chilling thought settled in her stomach. How many Ascendair flights were in the air right now with these ghost components inside them? How many hundreds of passengers were unknowingly entrusting their lives to an airline that was gambling with their safety to inflate its profit margins? Her flight back to Chicago was the next morning, with the same first officer, Mark Gallagher. The prospect of sitting next to him for 5 hours now filled her with a new kind of dread. It wasn't just about his attitude anymore. It was about what he represented. He was part of the sickness, and she was the only one who knew the diagnosis. Just as she was about to log off, an email from David arrived. The subject line was a single word, confirmed. She opened it. It was a list of 6 components on her aircraft, N9114AA, that he had flagged. The list included the Engine 2 vibration sensor, a hydraulic actuator in the right main landing gear, and, most terrifyingly, 2 high-pressure turbine blades within Engine 2. All of them traced back to Aero Component Solutions. All of them, according to his calculations, based on their original manufacturing date, were flying hundreds of cycles past their FAA-mandated service life. David's final line in the email was a stark warning. Imani, you're not flying a plane. You're flying a ticking time bomb. And Richard Sterling is the one who helped build it. Imani leaned back in her chair, the hotel room's generic art in beige walls seeming to close in around her. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. This was bigger than disrespect. It was bigger than her career. This was about the fundamental trust that every passenger places in an airline, a trust that Ascendair was shattering with every single flight. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't just report it. That would get buried in corporate red tape. She had to dismantle it. And to do that, she needed undeniable proof. The next flight to Chicago was no longer just a commute. It was an evidence-gathering mission. The flight back to Chicago was steeped in a surreal, icy calm. Knowing she was piloting an aircraft laden with time-expired parts gave Imani a chilling focus. Every vibration, every flicker of a gauge, every sound from the engines was no longer just data. It was a potential symptom of the disease she had uncovered. The lives of 180 passengers and crew were in her hands, and she had never been more aware of the weight of that responsibility. Mark Gallagher was noticeably subdued. Perhaps her commanding performance on the flight to San Diego had earned his grudging respect, or maybe he was simply tired of the conflict. He performed his duties with a new, sullen efficiency, devoid of the earlier passive aggression. But his silence was just as damning. He was a cog in the machine, and whether he knew the full extent of the danger or not, His willful ignorance made him complicit. Imani decided to use his compliance to her advantage. She needed more than just David's data. She needed real-time evidence, irrefutable proof that would stand up to scrutiny from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA. "Mark," she began, her tone neutral and professional, "I'm still not comfortable with that vibration reading on engine 2. It's subtle, but it's persistent. I want to run a full engine diagnostic and download the raw data stream. I'm going to log it as an official pilot report for maintenance." Mark stiffened. A formal pilot report, or PIREP, creates a paper trail that cannot be easily ignored. It forces the maintenance team to address the issue specifically and document their actions. It was the opposite of the quiet, corner-cutting culture he was used to. "Captain, with all due respect, we'll be writing it up post-flight anyway," he argued, his old defensiveness creeping back. "Running a full diagnostic now is unnecessary. It's well within the green." "The green band is a range, not a single number, First Officer," Imani countered, her voice like steel. "And this engine is living at the very top of that range. For my peace of mind, and for the safety of this aircraft, we're running the diagnostic." Acknowledge. She had cornered him. To refuse a direct command related to a safety concern would be a catastrophic breach of protocol, something that could jeopardize his license. He couldn't risk it. "Acknowledged, Captain," he gritted out. For the next 10 minutes, Imani navigated the aircraft's complex computer system, initiating a deep-level diagnostic test on both engines. The system compiled thousands of data points, temperatures, pressures, rotation speeds, and micro-vibrations far too subtle for a human to feel. While Engine 1's data produced a clean, smooth baseline, Engine 2's results painted a damning picture. There it was, in raw, unprocessed data. A distinct, rhythmic imbalance. A signature that David Hayes had described as the classic sign of a fatigued or mismatched turbine blade. It was the ghost in the machine, captured in black and white. She saved the entire data file, encrypting it and sending a copy to a secure personal cloud server via the plane's satellite Wi-Fi. It was her smoking gun. Her next target was Captain Richard Sterling. She needed to understand his role more clearly. Was he a kingpin or just a pawn? "You've flown with Captain Sterling a lot, haven't you, Mark?" she asked casually, as if making small talk. The question surprised him. Yeah, Rick's a great guy, one of the best. He's been my mentor." "He seems very hands-on with maintenance for a pilot," Imani probed gently. Mark puffed up with pride, eager to defend his hero. "That's what makes him so good. He doesn't just fly the planes, he understands them. He says it's our job to help the guys on the ground be more efficient. Not every little flicker needs a multi-million-dollar part replacement, you know? He saved the company a fortune, and it's why he's on the fast track to a big corner office at headquarters." Efficient. There was that word again. It was the corporate euphemism for the entire criminal enterprise. And Mark had just confirmed Sterling's central role. He wasn't just signing off on logs, he was the bridge between management's desire for efficiency and the pilots and mechanics who had to implement it. He was the enforcer, the one who gave the dangerous practice a veneer of operational legitimacy. His mentorship of young pilots like Mark was nothing more than indoctrination into a culture of corruption. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place as they prepared for landing at O'Hare. Imani was reviewing the flight plan when a new message popped up on her screen. It was a company-wide memo from the CEO of Ascendair, a slick corporate raider named Michael Vance. The memo celebrated a record-breaking quarter of profitability, praising the entire team for their commitment to operational streamlining and cost-effective solutions. It specifically named Richard Sterling, promoting him to the newly created position of Vice President of Flight Operations and Efficiency. Imani felt a wave of nausea. The conspiracy went all the way to the top. The CEO wasn't just aware of the scheme, he was rewarding its architect. This wasn't a few bad apples. This was the entire orchard, rotten from the roots up. The airline wasn't just cutting corners. It was a criminal organization masquerading as a legitimate carrier. When they landed and taxied to the gate, the charade was over. Imani completed her post-flight checks with grim determination. As she prepared to leave the cockpit, she turned to Mark Gallagher. "Mark, I'm formally writing up Engine 2 for an immediate mandatory inspection. I've included the raw diagnostic data in my report. I expect that engine to be grounded until the turbine assembly is physically inspected, piece by piece. Mark's face went pale. This was a massive escalation. It would ground the plane for days, cost a fortune, and invite scrutiny from the FAA. It was a direct challenge to Sterling's entire efficiency model. "You can't do that," he stammered. "It's unnecessary. Sterling will—" "Captain Sterling is no longer in your chain of command." Imani cut him off, her voice devoid of any emotion. "And I am. This aircraft is unsafe. My report is filed. If you or anyone else tries to clear this plane for flight without a physical inspection, I will consider it a willful endangerment of public safety, and I will report you directly to the NTSB and the FAA hotline. Am I understood?" She held his gaze, her dark eyes unwavering. In that moment, he saw that she was not just a pilot he disrespected. She was an unmovable object of integrity, and his entire corrupt world was about to crash right into her. He gave a weak, terrified nod. Imani walked off the plane, leaving Mark standing there, a deer in the headlights. She ignored the glare from Karen Miller at the gate. Their petty power games were a distant memory, the prelude to a war they couldn't possibly comprehend. She didn't go home. She went straight to a small, anonymous hotel near the airport. She took out her laptop and began to assemble her dossier. She had David Hayes' analysis, the fraudulent part certifications, the maintenance logs, the in-flight diagnostic data, the CEO's incriminating memo, and her own detailed captain's report. It was an airtight case, a story of corporate greed so profound it was willing to risk fiery, high-altitude death for the sake of a quarterly earnings report. She wasn't just a pilot anymore. She was a whistleblower, and she was about to bring the entire corrupt house of cards that was Ascendair crashing down to the ground. 2 days later, Imani Webb walked into the Great Lakes Regional Office of the FAA, a bland bureaucratic building that held the power of life and death over every airline in the central United States. She wasn't wearing her pilot's uniform. She was dressed in a simple, sharp business suit, her hair pulled back. She carried a single, heavy briefcase. In it was the evidence that would detonate a bomb in the heart of the American aviation industry. She had secured the meeting under the Whistleblower Protection Program, her identity initially shielded. She was ushered into a sterile conference room where 3 people waited for her: a senior FAA safety inspector named Alan Croft, a stern-faced agency lawyer, and a veteran investigator from the Department of Transportation's Office of the Inspector General. The initial atmosphere was one of weary skepticism. These officials saw a steady stream of disgruntled employees with petty grievances. "Ms. Webb," Alan Croft began, his tone polite but distant, "we understand you have some concerns regarding the maintenance procedures at Ascendair." Imani didn't respond with a long, emotional story. She responded with overwhelming, undeniable fact. She opened her briefcase and placed a thick, perfectly organized binder on the table. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and clear, "I'm not here to share concerns. I'm here to report a systemic, criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government and willfully endanger the flying public, a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of Ascendair's corporate structure." For the next 2 hours, she walked them through the evidence, piece by painstaking piece. She started with her own aircraft, N9114AA. She presented the maintenance logs, then laid David Hayes' analysis alongside them, showing the impossible timelines and fraudulent serial numbers. She played the raw data from her in-flight diagnostic of Engine 2, the digital signature of the faulty turbine blades stark and damning. The lawyer's pen, which had been doodling on a legal pad, stilled. The Inspector General leaned forward, his eyes narrowed. Alan Croft, the safety inspector, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. "Aero Component Solutions," Croft murmured, tapping the fake certification papers. "We've seen this name pop up a few times in minor incident reports. We flagged it for a low-level audit, but it never seemed urgent." "It's a shell corporation," Imani stated, "designed to launder unserviceable, timed-out aircraft parts back into Ascendair's fleet. I have financial records here suggesting the company is registered to a holding firm with ties to Ascendair's own chief financial officer." She then presented the broader pattern David had uncovered. listing over a dozen other aircraft with similar suspicious maintenance histories. She highlighted the role of Captain, now Vice President, Richard Sterling, showing his signature on dozens of questionable repairs. She concluded by displaying the CEO's memo, the one praising Sterling for the very efficiency that was putting thousands of lives at risk. He wasn't just an accessory, Imani explained. He was the linchpin. He used his credibility as a senior pilot to intimidate mechanics and indoctrinate junior pilots like my first officer, Mark Gallagher, into believing this was a smart, acceptable way to do business. When she finished, there was a profound silence in the room. The initial skepticism had evaporated, replaced by a cold, simmering fury. She hadn't brought them a grievance. She had handed them a criminal indictment on a silver platter. The Inspector General was the first to speak, his voice a low growl. "This is the most egregious case of systemic safety fraud I've seen in 20 years. Alan Croft looked at Imani, his eyes filled with a new, deep respect. "Captain Webb, your thoroughness is astounding. You've done the work of an entire investigation team." "I'm a pilot," Imani said simply. "My job is to identify and mitigate risk. This is the greatest risk I've ever seen." The wheels of federal power began to turn with breathtaking speed. What happened next would become the stuff of aviation legend. There would be no warning, no preliminary letter, no chance for Ascendair to shred documents or hide evidence. At 9 a.m. the next morning, FAA and DOT agents, armed with federal warrants, walked unannounced into Ascendair's corporate headquarters in Chicago, their maintenance hubs in Dallas and Denver, and their administrative offices. Simultaneously, a sweeping emergency order of suspension was issued. Effective immediately, the air operator's certificate for Ascendair was revoked pending a full safety review. The order went out across the national airspace system. Ascendair flights, whether on the ground or in the air, were to be grounded at the nearest suitable airport. The chaos was immediate and absolute. In Atlanta, an Ascendair 737 was ordered to halt its takeoff roll just seconds from liftoff. In Los Angeles, passengers were told to deplane from a flight that was fully boarded. In the skies over Nebraska, an Ascendair pilot en route to Seattle was ordered by air traffic control to divert and land immediately in Omaha. The news alerts began to flash across phone screens and cable news chyrons. FAA grounds entire Ascendair fleet over significant safety concerns. The airline's stock, which had been soaring on the news of its record profitability, hit a digital cliff. It plummeted by 90% in the first hour of trading before the NASDAQ halted it completely. At the headquarters, a stunned CEO, Michael Vance, was led from his office by federal agents. A bewildered Richard Sterling, who had been enjoying his new VP office for all of 3 days, found his new desk being swarmed by investigators seizing his computers. And in a quiet hotel room, Imani Webb watched the news unfold, a grim sense of finality washing over her. She had been disrespected at the door of her cockpit. In response, she had calmly, methodically, and brilliantly taken their entire airline away from them. The first act of justice was complete. Now the karma was coming for the individuals who had put her and the public at risk. The grounding of Ascendair was a deafening thunderclap, but the lightning of personal karma struck its architects with precision and cruelty. The fallout was not a matter of corporate fines or slaps on the wrist. It was a series of personal reckonings, each perfectly tailored to the sins of the individual. Richard "Rick" Sterling, the architect. Rick Sterling, the newly minted Vice President of Efficiency, found that his new title made him the primary target of the federal investigation. He had believed his position and reputation made him untouchable. He was wrong. The evidence Imani and David had compiled was a steel trap. His signatures on the falsified logs, the emails where he pressured maintenance chiefs to use ACS parts, and the financial records linking him to kickbacks from the shell company formed an unbreakable chain. He was arrested not at his office, but at his sprawling, ostentatious home in a wealthy Chicago suburb. Perp walked past his horrified neighbors in luxury cars. The FAA permanently revoked his airline transport pilot license, an act they called the capital punishment of aviation. All his accolades, his thousands of flight hours, his legendary status, erased. His fat pension was frozen and seized as part of the criminal investigation. His wife, a society woman who married the image of a heroic airline captain, filed for divorce within a month, unable to bear the public humiliation. His trial was swift. He was convicted on multiple counts of conspiracy, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The judge, a former pilot himself, was merciless in his sentencing. "You did not just betray your company, Mr. Sterling," the judge declared, his voice ringing with contempt. "You betrayed the sacred trust that exists between every single person who flies and the pilot in the cockpit. You monetized their safety and sold it for parts. You are a disgrace to the uniform." Rick Sterling was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The once mighty captain, who commanded jets from 35,000 feet, would spend his golden years in a 6 by 9 foot cell, his view of the sky forever barred by steel. Mark Gallagher, the protege. Mark Gallagher tried to play the victim. During his FAA hearing, he claimed he was a young, impressionable co-pilot just following the orders of his mentor, Rick Sterling. He argued he had no knowledge of the overarching conspiracy. Imani, who was called to testify, calmly dismantled his defense. She recounted his condescending behavior, his dismissal of her safety concerns about the engine vibration, and his attempt to talk her out of filing the official pilot report. "Competence and integrity are not optional extras in the cockpit," she stated coolly. "A first officer is not a passenger. He is a failsafe. His job is to question, to verify, to be a second set of critical eyes." Mr. Gallagher chose to be willfully blind. His loyalty was not to the safety of the aircraft, but to a corrupt mentor. The FAA agreed. While he wasn't charged criminally, his career as a major airline pilot was over. His license was suspended for 5 years, and a permanent black mark was placed on his record. No reputable passenger airline would ever hire him again. The last anyone heard, Mark Gallagher, the man who once mocked Imani's authority, was flying decades-old cargo planes on the desolate ice road routes in northern Canada, living in transient motels, his dream of being a celebrated international captain, a bitter, frozen memory. Karen Miller, the gatekeeper. Karen Miller, the gate agent who started it all, was a minor footnote in the grand scheme, but her karma was no less poetic. In the chaotic corporate collapse, she was immediately fired. Convinced of her own victimhood, she filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against the bankrupt remains of Ascendair. Her case was thrown out. During discovery, Ascendair's lawyers uncovered a long history of passenger complaints against her for rude and discriminatory behavior. Worse, her own social media was a cesspool of prejudiced comments. The judge dismissed her suit, remarking that she was lucky not to be facing a civil rights lawsuit herself. Unemployable in the airline industry, Karen Miller, who once wielded her tiny bit of power to humiliate a decorated captain, ended up working as a cashier at a discount big box store. She spent her days forced to be polite to every customer, her authority reduced to asking, "Paper or plastic?" The condescending smirk she had given Imani was wiped from her face, replaced by the permanent, weary frown of a person who had learned too late that respect is a two-way street. Michael Vance, the CEO Michael Vance thought the corporate veil would protect him. He tried to blame everything on a few rogue employees, chief among them Rick Sterling. But the Inspector General's forensic accountants were relentless. They proved that Vance had not only approved the creation of the shell company, Aero Component Solutions, but had personally profited from it, funneling millions into offshore accounts. The memo praising Sterling's efficiency was the nail in his coffin, proving he knew and rewarded the cost-cutting measures. He was indicted on charges of massive corporate fraud and conspiracy. His assets were seized, his golden parachute ripped to shreds. He was forced to sell his Hamptons mansion and his private jet to pay his legal fees. He avoided a long prison sentence by cooperating with the authorities and turning over evidence on other corrupt executives. But his name became synonymous with corporate malfeasance. He was barred for life by the SEC from ever serving as an officer or director of a public company. Michael Vance, the man who sat at the very top of the pyramid, was left with nothing but his infamy. The airline itself, Ascendair, never flew again. Its assets were liquidated in a fire sale, its planes auctioned off for scrap and parts, the legitimate ones anyway. The name became a cautionary tale, a lesson taught in business ethics classes and aviation safety seminars for decades to come. The takedown was absolute, the karma for each participant precise and inescapable. In the aftermath of the Ascendair collapse, Imani Webb became an unwilling celebrity. The story of the black female captain who was denied entry to her own cockpit, only to ground the entire airline, was irresistible to the media. She was hailed as a hero, a champion of safety and integrity. Aviation Week put her on their cover. Major news networks requested interviews. Imani, however, shunned the spotlight. She gave one single concise statement to the press. "I am a pilot. My first and only duty is to the safety of my passengers and my crew. I did what any pilot should have done. The real story here is not about me. It is about the critical importance of safety regulations and the need for a culture of integrity in our industry." She knew that while many celebrated her, a bitter minority within the old guard of aviation would always see her as a troublemaker, someone who had aired the industry's dirty laundry. But she didn't care. Her actions had sent a shockwave through the boardrooms of every airline in the country. Audits were suddenly intensified. Maintenance budgets that had been shrinking were suddenly expanded. The Imani Webb effect, as it became known, made safety a top priority again, not just on paper, but in practice. She had, in all likelihood, saved hundreds of lives by preventing the inevitable disaster that Ascendair was flying towards. The most prestigious and respected airlines came calling. They didn't just offer her a pilot seat. They offered her leadership roles. They wanted her integrity, her meticulous eye, her unshakable character as part of their command structure. 6 months after she walked into the FAA office, Imani Webb sat once again in the left-hand seat of a cockpit. This time, it was a brand-new, state-of-the-art Boeing 787 Dreamliner, the flagship of a legacy carrier renowned for its commitment to safety. Her 4 stripes gleamed in the dawn light. Her new title wasn't just captain, it was check airman, a captain who trains and evaluates other captains, a guardian of the airline's highest standards. Her new first officer, a young, earnest man named Ben, looked at her with undisguised reverence. "It's an honor to fly with you, Captain Webb," he said, his voice genuine. "We all read about what you did. You're a legend." Imani offered him a small, warm smile. "The only thing that matters, Ben, is getting this plane and everyone on it to our destination safely. Let's run the checklist." As they prepared for takeoff, she looked out at the vast expanse of the airfield. She thought of Rick Sterling in his cell, of Mark Gallagher flying through Arctic nights, of Karen Miller scanning groceries, and of Michael Vance in his disgraced exile. Their paths were the direct result of the choices they had made, of the moment they chose prejudice and greed over professionalism and decency. Her own path had been forged in that same moment. They had tried to close a door on her, to tell her she didn't belong, but in refusing to be diminished, she had opened a door for hundreds of other pilots, mechanics, and crew members who now felt empowered to speak up. She had affirmed that integrity was not a liability, but the most powerful asset a pilot could possess. The tower cleared them for takeoff. Ben advanced the throttles and the powerful engines spooled up with a clean, perfect roar, the sound of a machine in perfect health. As the Dreamliner accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the morning sky, Imani took the controls. She banked the aircraft to the east, chasing the rising sun. The view from her office had never looked so clear. She wasn't just flying a plane, she was piloting the future of an industry she had helped to save. And from 38,000 feet, the view was beautiful. Captain Imani Webb's story is a powerful reminder that true authority isn't found in a title or a uniform, but in unshakable integrity and the courage to do what's right, no matter the personal cost. A single act of prejudice meant to humiliate and exclude became the catalyst that exposed a deadly conspiracy, saving countless lives and delivering a stunning blow of karma to those who put profit before people. Her journey from the jet bridge of disrespect to the captain's seat of a flagship aircraft is a testament to the fact that one person, armed with the truth, can indeed move mountains, or in this case, ground an entire airline. If Imani's story of courage and ultimate vindication inspired you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this video with others to spread the message that integrity and safety must always come first. And for more stories of justice served and karma delivered, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. What part of the story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below.